What can the recent riots in Britain teach us about multiculturalism and the relationship between Western culture and Islam? And why, according to my guest today, Judaism is the target of all the secular ideologies that are undermining the West. Hello and welcome to the Spirit of the Times podcast. I am Matan Hasidim, and to discuss these questions and more, I am more than happy to host today the well-known journalist, broadcaster, and distinguished author, Melanie Phillips. Hello, Melanie.
Hello, Matan. Very good to see you.
Thank you very much for joining me here in Jerusalem. So we are speaking now after the end of the wave of riots that broke out all over Britain, following the terrible murders in Southport. Here in Israel, most media channels frame the riots as extreme right-wing thugs who are full of xenophobia towards Muslims. What do you think is at the core of the anger we have seen among many from the white British public in the UK towards immigrants and Muslims in particular?
The immediate cause of those riots, the thing that sparked the riots, was a terrible atrocity that happened in a school where little children who were involved in a Taylor Swift-themed dance class were attacked at random by a young man who stabbed them and killed three of them, murdered three of them, and left others injured. What happened then immediately was that people on social media said falsely that the attacker was a Muslim asylum seeker and had even been on the security service's watch list. This sparked huge riots and demonstrations, even when the police said he was not a Muslim asylum seeker. He was actually a young man who had been born in Cardiff, in Wales, in the United Kingdom, but of parents who had immigrated to Britain, I think 2 decades previously, from Rwanda. So he was a young black man, but he'd been born in Britain. Nevertheless, the people on social media continued to say immigrants are destroying the country, Muslims, asylum seekers, and they just carried on. And there were very, very, very serious riots. They weren't just riots in the sense of people running around, causing mayhem and destroying property. There was very specific attacks on mosques. Random mosques were attacked. Muslims were basically forced to bolt themselves into their homes. And in one particular instance, there was an attempt to burn down a hostel for asylum seekers with the people inside. Fortunately, that was stopped before it got any further. So very, very serious indeed. Now, who was producing this mayhem? Well, there were what's called influencers and agitators on social media, some of whom had neo-Nazi associations, some of whom were just thugs, hooligans, and they were inciting the mob. And the people who took to the streets were, among them, neo-Nazi far-right thugs, but also just a lot of ordinary people who were not far-right. They were not thugs. They were saying something similar but quite different. And what they were saying was that this was a kind of tipping point for them, because for years, I would say for decades, their very understandable concerns about a rate of immigration, both legal and illegal immigration, which was completely out of control, and which was transforming parts of the country into a place they couldn't recognize anymore as their home, because it was being filled with people from cultures which were very, very different from Britain and who would not integrate into Britain. There was a tremendous pressure on public services at a very straightforward level. Too many people trying to use schools, hospitals, family doctor services. The whole thing was breaking down. And people had had enough, not just because of this pressure, but because whenever they had protested against this, they were told that they were evil, that they were racist, that they were xenophobic, that they were Islamophobic. Now, some of them undoubtedly were, but a very large number were not. They were making what, in my view, is a perfectly reasonable point of view. And when this atrocity happened, all this frustration spilled out. And that was the kind of underlying reason for this disorder. But it was treated in exactly the way that had brought them onto the streets in the first place, by the police and the politicians, basically calling them all far-right extremist thugs, and completely dismissing the idea that there was any kind of reasonable point being made.
You talked about you've mentioned the influencers, and recently you referred to Tommy Robinson as an influencer who agitated the atmosphere in the country during the days of the riots. I myself watched both of his interviews with Jordan Peterson and also follow a bit of his activism, which has helped raise awareness, I think it's fair to say, of Muslim violence in the UK. For example, the appalling phenomenon of grooming gangs in which Muslim men found and raped white British women. This opinion of yours about him surprised me a bit. What do you make of Tommy Robinson?
I think you reflect what I would respectfully suggest is a very wrong-headed view of Tommy Robinson, formed particularly in America, but also to a certain extent here in Israel, which basically takes the form of, well, this guy is standing up against Islamization, therefore he must be a good thing.
He seems like a working-class guy that doesn't have a PhD, of course. And
Tommy Robinson did not start his public career, as it were, as a defender of Britain against Islamization. He started it as a member of a neo-Nazi group. He started it as a known football hooligan. He started it as somebody who collected convictions for violence and disorder. He was a thug. He then magically reinvented himself, I would suggest, by piggybacking on the back of the absolute scandal of the grooming gangs. Now, the grooming gangs was a phenomenon which was truly terrible, in which for, I don't know, the best part of 20 years, gangs of men who were overwhelmingly of Pakistani Muslim heritage preyed upon young girls, young white girls, aged 14, 15, 16, some of them below the age of sexual consent, who came from the wrong side of the tracks. Many of them came from children's homes. They came from really very bad backgrounds. They were very vulnerable. And these men seduced these girls by pretending to be people who would be their boyfriends, give them a good time. They drugged them, they got them drunk, they abused them, they raped them, repeatedly raped them, multiply raped each of them. And they used them, and they handed these girls around to each other. Now, this was ignored, amazing to relate, by the entire establishment of police and social workers. Why? Because they were frightened that if they went for these men, they would be accused of racism.
Islamophobic, being Islamophobic.
They didn't even say Islamophobia. They said racism, because these people were all brown-skinned. And in addition to the fear of being called racist, there was something, I would say, almost as terrible, if not more terrible. The police dismissed these girls as little prostitutes because they came from the wrong side of the tracks, because they were sluttish. They were girls who had no morals in the eyes of the police. They were girls who would, they were sexually free. These were children, 14, 15. But because they lived this kind of sexually licentious life, because that was the kind of terrible background they came from, the police dismissed them. So when the girl said, he raped me, the police said, don't try that on with me. So it was ignored for 20 years. Now, the person who brought this out in British society was not Tommy Robinson. It was actually my colleague at the Times newspaper, a man called Andrew Norfolk, who wrote about it. And this unleashed the floodgates of public opprobrium upon what was happening. Everybody was amazed, aghast, appalled, horrified. Inquiries were set in train, public inquiries. And what then happened was that a very large number of criminal trials took place of these members of these so-called grooming gangs. These trials are still taking place from time to time. Now, this problem has not gone away. It is still a major problem because it's a cultural problem. It's institutionalized cultural problem in the Muslim community. That's another matter. But Tommy Robinson perceived correctly that this was a major social grievance, and he used that to remake his reputation by running around screaming about it. And then he pretended on YouTube, to great effect among people abroad who know nothing about what's going on in Britain, he pretended that he alone was standing up and bringing this to public attention. He alone was standing in the face of Islamization of Britain. Now, that was bad enough. But what he then did was a series of events, or a series of actions, which to me showed that this man is not somebody behind whose flag anybody should ever march. He is not a man who is committed to uphold one of the core values of British society, which is the rule of law and respect for democracy. He's the opposite. So to give you an example, there were trials of these grooming gangs going on in, I think it was Huddersfield. He took it upon himself to parade around the court, out from the outside of the court with a megaphone. He put it all on YouTube, denouncing everybody who was going in as a paedophile. Now, in Israel, people may not realize, and in America they certainly don't realize, that in Britain there are very, very, very strict rules governing the course of a trial. In fact, from the point at which a suspect is charged with an offence, the media cannot report anything about that person other than the barest details, name, age, whatever. On the basis that the British system believes that a jury must be protected from anything that may influence those jurors' minds. The juror must come to the trial with a mind as free as possible from prior prejudice and must just listen to the evidence in court. So what Robinson was doing, prancing around outside the court, denouncing everybody as a paedophile, putting it onto YouTube, threatened the trial itself. And the judge had him in and said, this is a very serious offence. I'm going to sentence you to a period of imprisonment, which I will suspend. It's called a suspended sentence, on the basis that if you ever do anything like this again, you will go straight to prison. Another trial happened, which was in fact a linked trial. There was a series of men in linked trials. There were so many men in this grooming gang, the trials of them were split between 3 trials. So it was even more important that nothing was said from one trial to the next that could prejudice a jury. You may think this is odd, but this is the British system. Mm-hmm. This is British law. So he did it again, and he put it on YouTube, and he was sent to prison. And then I was assailed, because I wrote about how, what a dreadful man this was. And I was assailed by people mainly from America who said, you don't understand. Mm-hmm. The British state wants him murdered in prison. I mean, this is, as if the British state wanted to make him a martyr. Mm-hmm. They went to great lengths to protect him in prison from Muslims who might have attacked him. Mm-hmm. Anyway, since then, he hasn't reformed himself at all. He libeled a young Muslim boy in a northern school who had been attacked. It was videoed, his attack, the attack on him. An Islamophobic attack, people would say. I would never use that phrase. I would say it was an attack on him because he was a Muslim boy. And Robinson...
You refer to the attack with the bottle of water, right, in like a football field.
That's right. This attack was filmed. Mm-hmm. Tommy Robinson then went on video or social media or whatever it was and said...
He did a whole movie. I saw the movie.
Fine. So he said he wasn't the victim. He actually abused girls at the school. The boy sued for libel. The judge found that Robinson had libeled this young man, that all of Robinson's evidence, so-called, that Robinson brought to support his claim was completely without foundation. The people that he had interviewed didn't know what they were talking about, or they were speaking loosely, or there was no supporting evidence, or there was no evidence whatsoever, or whatever. The judge went through every allegation, threw it all out. And then Robinson did it again. He put it all again on YouTube and said, you know, I am being persecuted by the British state. I'm the only person who's standing up against this. And so a warrant was issued for his arrest. At which point, by a strange coincidence of timing, the riots that we've been talking about happened. And Robinson then popped up on holiday. And from his, as it were, from his sun lounger, he was inciting people on social media about Muslims, asylum seekers, immigrants to riot. And so he was part of that online mob that incited the actual mob to riot. And that's where we got to on that. Now, he said other things. He accused, he recycles myths that are going around. So there was a particularly dreadful attack on a grandmother who was leapt upon and attacked. And it was said on social media it was a Somali immigrant. In fact, it wasn't a Somali immigrant. I don't think it was an immigrant at all. But Robinson was part of the online mob that said Somali immigrant. He keeps doing this kind of thing over and over again. And people abroad keep falling for it because, you know, like many truly far-right people, he's latched on to a absolutely sound social, cultural grievance where people are completely correct to say there's this terrible thing called Islamophobia, which is supposedly to protect Muslims from prejudice, but actually is a means of shutting down legitimate and necessary discussion of bad things that are done in the Islamic world. People are absolutely right to say that's a terrible thing. People are absolutely right to say that when there are Islamist atrocities in Britain, the first reaction of the governing class is to say, we must protect Muslims against Islamophobia. They're perfectly right to say there are double standards. They're perfectly right to say there is a problem of creeping Islamization. They're perfectly right to say that immigration is out of control. Now, you know, it doesn't mean that all immigrants are bad. It doesn't mean that all Muslims are bad. On the contrary, many Muslims in Britain are perfectly law-abiding, not extreme. They sign up to British values. Many, you know, immigration has enhanced British society, but it has to be limited and reasonable and within certain constraints. But my point is that an agitator like Robinson, like other truly far-right agitators, perceives the legitimate grievance and then hijacks it because they're basically thugs. They basically want to cause disorder. They want to make themselves the hero of their own story. Whatever it is, they hijack the true grievance. And then it causes such terrible confusion that it's almost impossible to pick your way through it.
Yeah, okay, so maybe it's because I'm not from the UK, so I fall for it. But it's okay, because Jordan Peterson fall for it too. So I'm in a good...
Very much so.
A good boat. So in this context, you've mentioned your book, Londonistan. It looks like that. I would like to quote from this book. His title is How Britain Has Created a Terror State Within, from 2006. And I'm quoting, believing that Islamic terrorism is motivated by an ideology which has hijacked and distorted Islam, it will not acknowledge the extremism within mainstream Islam itself. Defining extremism narrowly as supporting violence against Britain, it makes that catastrophic mistake of treating the aim of Islamizing Britain as an eccentric but unthreatening position and not one to be taken at all seriously. End quote. So this quote is taken from the new foreword you wrote to the book in 2008. 16 years later, after you wrote those words, what do you think of the situation of the elites in Britain or even the West in general towards the Islamic threat to the West?
As far as the elites are concerned, it hasn't got any better. It's in fact got rather worse in the sense that they are still in supreme denial of the religious nature of what is a religious jihad, an attempt to Islamize the West for religious reasons. In terms of the public, a completely different matter. over the years since I wrote Londonistan, and even when I wrote Londonistan, even when it was published, but certainly since then, there has been a major a development among, I think, ordinary people, certainly in Britain, and I'm pretty sure also in Europe, in mainland Europe as well, that this is a terrible problem because they can see it increasing year by year. They can see the actual evidence. They can see, in France, they can see churches being burned. In Britain, they can see the development of Sharia-led enclaves. They can see what happened at the last general election, which was
Islamic
astounding.
movement vote, right?
Astounding to people, not to me, but astounding to people for whom, they've not seen a problem building up. Suddenly, as it were, out of the blue, Britain had sectarian Muslim politics. Suddenly, out of the blue, you had people standing for Parliament, for election to Parliament, in a British general election, which is about British issues, on which people vote a government which is going to look after their interests in Britain, to do with British society, Britain's society. You had a number of people standing on a platform of Gaza-Palestine, as if that was a domestic issue, like building a local hospital or something like that, or the future of the health service. I mean, it's ludicrous. And 5 of these people were elected. 5. Now, in Britain, that's an earthquake. In Britain, it's a 2-party system. It's not like in Israel. It's called first past the post. It is a system which is totally hostile to a third party, let alone 5 individuals standing on Palestine, Gaza, and they are the members of Parliament. And now we see that they have formed 4 of them are Muslims, and one of them was Jeremy Corbyn, who was the former very hard left leader of the Labour Party, now an independent member of Parliament, and now part of this squad. And they've now produced a kind of, we are now a kind of a grouping, a political grouping, and we now have demands. And the demands are to basically turn Britain completely against Israel, to make Israel a pariah state within Britain's governing class, and to Islamize Britain slowly and incrementally in ways that they will set out. So this didn't come out of the blue. This has been building for years, and there is still a reluctance to talk about it. No one, there was a certain amount of, anguish in the media, but it was quite limited. And other things are happening. I mean, there was an incident, I think it was 2021, at a school in northern England, in Yorkshire, in which a teacher wanted to illustrate to his class that was discussing freedom of speech. He used...
Let me guess, picture of Muhammad.
He used a picture of Muhammad to illustrate it.
Okay.
Immediate death threats. He is still in hiding. He is still in hiding for his life. No one talks about this anymore. It's like a thing that, oh yeah, that teacher, oh yeah, I remember. What? What? Where are the members of Parliament jumping up and down? Where is the government saying, this has got to stop? They don't touch it. Then you had another incident not long ago. There's a very, very successful state-financed school in London. It's called Michaela. It has astounding results. And not just in terms of academic prowess, it is outstanding, but it turns around mainly children from mainly immigrant, single-parent, deprived families. It turns them into not just stellar academic students, but people who actually believe in Britain's values. They're taught to support the royal family, the armed forces, and so on. And they're taught the great works of English literature, including during the colonial period. Anyway, it's a well-known school. It is a phenomenon. And the head teacher is a phenomenon, and it is her creation. Out of the blue, as it were, a group of Muslim girls started praying in the playground. Full works on the floor, and it was stopped because the school is resolutely secular. The way it works is that in order that there should be total harmony in the school, no religion at all, Totally secular. Okay, fine. So this was a direct challenge to this. It was stopped. The parents took the school to court. And the court, thankfully, the judge threw it out. But she was taken to court. That's what's going on, creeping. And nobody says, this what's happening. You know, the government doesn't say what's happening. The government says, we're now, the new Labour government says, you know, we're going to crack down on Islamophobia. This is what sends people wild. This is what sends people out into the streets. And there are many, many other examples I could give you. But so from the point of view of, you know, what I wrote in 2006 in my book on Afghanistan, it's not been addressed.
But just back to the quote, the point is that maybe you try to make, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's very, very hard to distinct between radical Islam and just regular Muslims. Let's say it's harder than I talked to many historians of the Middle East and Islam, and from the academia, they have their very, very hard distinction between, no, listen, this is radical Islam, this is terrorists, and this is just Muslim, regular Muslims, and the most majority of Muslims are peaceful, and, you know, Islam is really, in its core, is a religion of peace. And so in the academia, there's a lot of this kind of talk.
Yeah, so you're talking about academia in Israel, I presume.
In Israel and abroad.
Yeah.
So most of them, of course,
in Israel, this was
yeah.
behind the Conceptia, which led to October 7. And I had these discussions over years with people in Israel who would say, don't tell me about Islam. Don't tell us. We know. We live here. We live with these people. Right. Did they ever get that wrong? And in Britain, it's the same kind of thing, that the elites, including people in the intelligence service, including people in the security service, they won't say this is a religious thing. Why? Because they say this will demonize all Muslims, to which I say, this is a non sequitur. This does not follow. As far as I can see, and I'm only a journalist, but I have done quite a lot of research, and I've talked to a lot of people, and as far as I can see, you have a situation in which Islam is not a religion of peace. Islam means submission. Its whole religious philosophy, as it were, is so different from Judaism. Judaism, you know, we are the most quarrelsome people on earth. And in our holy scriptures, we argued with the Almighty, who said, I've had it with these people. They are dreadful, okay? Argument, disputation, quarreling is in our DNA. It's in our religious DNA. That's what we do. We use reason. We argue. Okay, there are bad things that follow from that, but put that to one side. Islam is very different. Islam believes that the word of God is unchallengeable. That's it. You submit. And from that derives the idea that if you are a Muslim, a religious Muslim, a religiously believing Muslim, you believe that Islam is something that encompasses all good things, and everything outside the world of Islam is bad.
And Muhammad, and this is a key point, was a role model for the best man that ever existed.
So this is like, you know, this is a sort of unchallengeable orthodoxy. Now, what you then had was, you know, at various stages you can point to Muslim reformers, Muslim liberals who adapted themselves to Western values, and that happened over time, but they were all basically wiped out over time by the people who took the very purist line of that everybody has to submit to Islam. Everybody in the world has to submit to Islam. So it became a religion of war, not a religion of peace, a religion of war and conquest. Now, scroll forward to today. What does the Muslim world think about that? Well, the unfortunate thing is this. It is perfectly true that there are millions of Muslims who don't believe in that, who just want to live just like we all want to live.
Peacefully.
You know, have a family, have a job, live peacefully.
Yeah.
And in Britain, that is absolutely correct. That is the majority who just want that. And the majority, if they're religious, it's very token. They're mainly cultural Muslims. And that's fine. And it's fine if they use the Islamic faith to pray, to elevate themselves to do good works, to be charitable. This is all part of Islam. That's absolutely fine. And I would say that probably the majority are like that. But the minority are very different. And we're not talking about a few people. We're talking about, I've forgotten now the figures. I'm speaking from the top of my head. But something like 20 to 30% when asked in opinion polls, they want to live under Sharia law. Now, Sharia law does not recognize a secular authority at all. Sharia law in and of itself is a subversive ideology that is a threat to democracy. You've got 20 to 30% who want to live like that. There are an estimated 4 million Muslims in Britain. I think that's a conservative estimate, but that's the official kind of estimate. You know, you do the math, as they say. 20 to 30% is a lot of people. And then you have, you know, extremists and so on. And it may be a small proportion, and we should always be very careful to distinguish between Muslims who are okay and Muslims who are not okay. But the Muslims who are not okay are too large for a functioning democracy to cope with adequately. And the problem is that while it is perfectly true that there are interpretations of the religion, and there are Muslims who interpret it in a different kind of way, like the Sufis, they live, you know, they take from it the kind of spiritual sustenance. That's absolutely fine. While that
so jihad is like an inner struggle and not like an active war.
While that is true, it is also true that in the world in general, in the Islamic world overall, across the planet, across the globe, unfortunately, for a number of years, the dominant philosophy has been jihadi religion of war, by either physical war or by democratic encroachment, which is where the Muslim Brotherhood comes in.
Yes.
Muslim Brotherhood, as in Hamas, believes in violence and murder and extermination. Muslim Brotherhood, as in Britain and America, believes in working through the democratic process and subverting it. Now, this is not accepted or acknowledged by an elite which says it's nothing to do with religion. Now, why do they say that? Why do they say that? First of all, ignorance. Okay. But why are they ignorant? Why don't they want to find out? And I think there are two reasons. First is obviously fear. There are too many people who believe in the religion of war now to deal with. So we can't even acknowledge it, because to acknowledge it means we'll have to do something about it. And do something about it means basically going to war with these people. We can't do that. We can't take them on because they will defeat us because they're too many for us. So it's fear.
Wow.
That's one thing. But the more insidious thing, and that is particularly true, it's particularly true in, I'm going to say particularly true in Britain, but it's particularly true in the secular West. The secular West really doesn't understand religion at all. It insists on seeing everyone in the world through its own prism, a secular prism, in which everybody is governed by reason. Everybody is answerable to calls to their own self-interest. Every problem, therefore, has to be dealt with through negotiation and compromise. This is how America sees Israel, unfortunately. As we can all see, we're living through this nightmare. And the idea that you have religious fanatics, well, you know, what they're believing is like so stupid. They don't really believe that. Scratch them and they will find that, you know, you appeal to their self-interest. And, you know, we can make it all go away. So the idea that you have, under the umbrella of the Muslim community in Britain, in America, in France, in the Netherlands, you have a section of that community which believes that by forcing people to submit to Islam, they are doing holy work. They are doing the work of God himself, to which there can be no argument, clearly, for which there can be no negotiation, clearly. Now, the British elite, the Western elite, cannot get their heads around this. They don't understand what religious fanaticism is because they don't understand what religion is. They don't understand how it motivates people in the best way. It motivates people to do great, heroic and good things. And at the worst, It motivates people to do the absolute reverse of that, the worst of all bad things. They don't get it.
So here I want to ask you about maybe a solution. You know, I recently read a tweet by God Saad, who wrote that Western countries are on a clear path towards a civil war between Muslims and non-Muslims. Do you think there is an escape route that can be taken, or is it already too late, as God Saad says, considering, for example, the power that you've been talking about that Muslims have gained in countries like Britain, for example?
It's never too late. It's never over till it's over. Yes, it is a very, very serious problem, and it's becoming a more intractable problem year by year because it's being allowed to fester and increase and so on.
And Islam is the most fastest growing religion.
Yeah,
fastest growing religion, yeah.
But it's absolutely not impossible. I believe that there is a tremendously I believe that there is a tremendously large and swelling resistance to this growing in the West. We can see it politically. It takes different forms in different countries. In America, it's President Trump. In Britain, it was the Brexit vote. In France and other European countries, it's the rise of what's called populist leaders. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in America, in the American election. And Brexit, you know, is by no means a success story in Britain because, in my view, because of the incompetence and worse of the Conservative administration that is now no longer in power. But the fact is that wherever you look, and whatever form these uprisings are taking, they are basically the same thing. They are millions of ordinary people who are saying, we're not prepared to live like this anymore. We are seeing the things that are dearest to us taken away from us. Our nation, the borders of our nation. We no longer have a nation if we have no borders. Mm-hmm. We have no borders. Mm-hmm. They are not being defended against illegal and even legal immigration. So we don't have a nation anymore. The culture of our nation, we're being told that, you know, the West was born in original sin, the original sins of racism and colonialism and being white-skinned. That is itself a racist idea. The idea that we are racist because we are white-skinned, that is a racist idea. We are being told that we can't have our culture because that is racist, that is xenophobic. We're entitled to our culture. This is what defines us. This is what makes us call this place home. And it's being taken away from us in all kinds of ways, and we're not having it anymore. That's basically what they're all saying. Now,
because of this attitude, I have to ask, can you see in your imagination, in our lifetime, Nigel Farage as the Britain Prime Minister?
It's a stretch. It's not completely impossible. It all depends on whether the Conservative Party actually finally decides what conservatism is or should be and defends it properly and defends the nation and its values properly. If it doesn't do that, then I don't know about Farage being Prime Minister because, as I've said to you before, the British electoral system is such that it doesn't lend itself to this kind of insurgency in parliamentary terms. So I'm not quite sure about that. But I'm absolutely sure that what he represents will grow and grow as an insurgency, a popular insurgency, which will cause chaos and wreak havoc on Britain's political structure. That I'm sure will happen. It's possible that the Conservative Party will, you know, pull itself together, but it would have to be a dramatic change. But it's not impossible. What I'm saying is, you know, people who say, you know, it's all over, they look at, you know, the numbers of Muslims. They look at the and they say, well, that's it. It's over. Well, no, it's not over. Because the reason why we've had this increasing threat of Islamization is because the radical Islamists, people like Osama bin Laden and others like him, the theologians who lay behind him, they all said this in terms over the years. you've got a society, which is the West, which has hollowed itself out. It no longer does Christianity. Without a religion, society collapses. And we can see what's happened as a result of the fact that it's become a secular culture. They have nothing to believe in anymore. They're getting rid of all their values. They're trampling over all their values. And consequently, they don't know what they are. And because they don't know what they are certainly not going to fight for what they are because they don't know what they are. And so there's a vacuum. And in that vacuum is our opportunity. And that's what's happened. All that the West has to do, and it's quite simple, is to stand up and resist this by saying, we now know what we are. We are reaffirming what we are. We are going to take steps to uphold our institutionally core values, which are basically biblical values, and we are not going to have anybody undermine them. Now, the West hasn't done that, and I think it's impossible to exaggerate the importance of the fact that it's not done that, and it's impossible to exaggerate the significance of the effect of it doing so, because in my view, and I may be wrong, but in my view, predatory Islamism would retreat. It's advancing because there's no resistance. It would retreat because it would be pushed back. And it's the same here in Israel. Israel is the paradigm nation in many respects, but in this respect, at this moment of crisis that we're all living through, this terrible nightmare in Israel, Israel is resisting, and it's winning, despite the fact that the West says it's losing. But that's because the West perceives this through its own deadly prism. Israel is winning, and it will win, because it knows what it is. It knows not just what it believes, it understands where it's come from, it understands what it represents, and more to the point, it loves what it is, and it wants to continue what it is. That's why people here are having so many babies. They want to continue. In the West, they're not having babies. They are literally dying out. They don't want to continue. Now, that can be turned around with proper leadership, religious leadership, cultural leadership,
national identity,
political
maybe.
leadership. At the moment, where is it? We're all saying, where is it? But it can be done. It just, if you will it, it can be done, as Herzl sort of said.
Yeah, so in regarding to the cultural revolution taking place in the West, your book from 2010, The World Turned Upside Down, The Global Battle for God, Truth and Power, deals mainly with this cultural revolution, what you refer in many of your talks as the current death wish of the West. Among other argues, you argue there that Judaism is the target of all the secular ideologies that are undermining the West today. This is a big argue. Can you expand on this?
It is a remarkable thing when you look at these ideologies, which basically all are man-made ideas that replaced biblical values. And they very much set out to replace biblical values because they set out to replace the West. They set out to create a new society because on the basis that the West was founded in original sin, and because the West was founded in original sin, it meant that the values on which the West was founded were all bad. So these secular ideologies really set out to change the West into a new and better world based on, brotherhood of man, a utopia, sort of kumbaya utopia. And when you look at these ideologies at their root, it's amazing to see that they all have as their target Judaism, the Jewish people, or the State of Israel. I'll just give you some. I mean, there are a lot of ideologies involved. They're all isms of one kind or another. But take, for example, the granddaddy of them all, which is moral relativism. This is the idea which is based on the idea that the individual is the center of the universe. So it's based on the idea that what I do and what I see and what I think trumps everything else. If I feel in the way that I do, if I feel I'm a victim, I am a victim. It doesn't matter what the facts are. If I live the way I want to live, then nobody has the right to say that it's any worse than any other way of life, and so on. Now, this is inimical to Judaism, because Judaism is the absolute diametric opposite of moral relativism. Judaism is all about, the foundational moral code of Judaism is moral accountability, the idea that we are all responsible for what we do. We take responsibility for what we do, and that there is an absolute distinction to be made between objective right and wrong, between truth and lies. It's an article of faith in the secular world. There is no such thing as objective truth. If you say there is such a thing as objective truth, that something is absolutely true, you are regarded as uneducated. It's very unsophisticated to argue that. Everything is relative. What I think, what I feel is my truth. As Oprah Winfrey said, it's my truth. Well, no, that is moral illiteracy. And Judaism is absolutely certain. There is no such thing as my truth. There is the truth. And you uphold the truth. And you fight lies and you fight abuses of the truth. So that is absolutely central. Then you look at other isms, other ideologies, and you find, again, take materialism. This idea, which is foundational to the secular way of looking at things, that everything in the world, the universe and beyond is explainable through material circumstance. It's all a thing. And of course, Judaism is all about, well, there is something beyond this world, which is not a thing. We can't actually explain it, and we can never explain it. It lies out with human experience. And that is, belief in God and all the rest of it. So materialism is a direct repudiation of Judaism. And the third thing, which is again it's become a kind of foundational belief these days, environmentalism. Now, Judaism holds that one should steward the earth. And I believe that one has a responsibility to look after our surroundings and to look after the earth and the environment. And we have a duty to animals, to be nice to animals, to be kind, and so on. This is all Judaic values, but environmentalism, deep environmentalism, is quite different. Deep environmentalism is based on the idea, it's basically pagan. It is based on the idea that the biblical belief in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, articulated in the book of Genesis, the biblical belief that human beings are the pinnacle of creation. That is, I wouldn't use the word racist, it's not quite appropriate, but basically it's an affront to the rest of nature. It's not true. And the idea that human beings are the pinnacle of creation is something that is driving the planet to extinction. Now, if you believe that human beings are not the pinnacle of creation, then human beings become expendable. And you go all down that rabbit hole into getting rid of people. It is an anti-human philosophy. It is so fundamentally anti-Judaism. The idea that it's all about, looking after the natural world. That is what Judaism is all about. It's not that. Environmentalism is not that. It's anti-human. So I would say these things are all anti-Jewish.
If I would like to push back, maybe I could have said that everything that you mentioned, like moral relativism and materialism and the environmentalism, new religion, is opposing Christianity doctrines as well, no?
Of course, absolutely.
So it's not unique to Judaism.
Well, Judaism is unique. Christianity would not have existed without Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. He was from Jew. Judaism was a sect that got out of hand, somewhat out of hand. But the values that Christianity embodies, the core values of the West, are Jewish values. They are Christian values. Christianity adopted them and to a certain extent adapted them. There are certain Jewish values.
Spreaded them around.
Well, I was going to say there are certain values which Christianity has developed which went in a different direction from Judaism. I would say, for example, Judaism stresses two values in particular, justice and compassion. But justice has the edge over compassion, because without justice you can't have compassion. Christianity is the other way around. It prioritizes compassion. Justice is of a lesser value, in my view. And there are other ways in which Christianity deviates from Judaism. But basically, when we talk about the core values of the West, if people think of them in terms of religion, for sure people think of them as Christian values, and at that level, it is completely correct. Christianity is the foundational religious establishment of the West. Absolutely, no question about that. But Christianity itself rests on Jewish values. And so when you have a secular world which is intent upon creating a new world in the West, the values that it's going for certainly are embodied in Christianity. It's against Christianity, of course. But the values that it's going for are fundamentally Jewish values. Mm-hmm. And consequently, it's absolutely no surprise to me that Israel and the Jewish people find themselves at this moment in the crosshairs of the secular West. Because ultimately, and this sounds a terrible thing to say, but I do believe it to be true, all these ideologies want to remove the idea central to Judaism of individual responsibility, accountability, and conscience. Individual conscience gets in the way of individual wants and likes. And the secular world is all about getting rid of anything that gets in the way of what the individual wants. And conscience is just too inconvenient. So they outsource conscience to things they can't do anything about, like saving the planet from extinction through carbon dioxide. But the things they can do something about, how I behave to another person, they don't want to know about that. Mm. And Judaism says that's what it's all about. So they have to get rid of Judaism completely. They have to get rid of the idea of conscience. To get rid of the idea of conscience, they have to get rid of Judaism. And in my view, what we're seeing in this eruption of insanity that we're living through in the world, in which when Israel is fighting for its life, the Western world has turned against the Jewish people. In my view, what's happening, that has many explanations, many layers, many levels, but ultimately, at the base, they want to get the Jews out of their heads, out of their world, and out of their conscience altogether. They want us gone. That's what's going on. It's all the same thing. And the people who are at the forefront of this, in the sense of the indigenous people of the West, tend to be the people who are saving the planet, people who are for lifestyle choice. They wrap themselves in the flags of gay people and trans people and every kind of people except the flag of the Jewish people, who have to be got rid of from their heads altogether.
I'm sharing with you a thought while we've been speaking. It's kind of like a new replacement theory. You know, when people in the West want to form a new religion, just like the early Christians, they need to develop a new, just like the early Christians do. And after it, Islam did. They need to replace the Jews as the so-called chosen people. So now the woke culture is like leading the morality in the world. So then they know, even like not really maybe unconscious, that they need to get rid of the Jews.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's I think that's what we're living through. And it's a terrible thing to say. It's a terrible thing to think. But I do think it's true.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you now the question that Professor Ruth Weiss said in our interview together was the $1 million question. So at this moment, the situation of Israel, internationally speaking, is quite depressing, since the countries that we naturally see as cultural partners, what we call the West, are busy destroying their own culture, and in the process are also tying Israel's hands, and preventing it from victory in Gaza. Just this week we saw how Britain intends to stop sale of arms to Israel. So the $1 million question is, what will Israel do internationally if the West collapses, or at least does not recover from the cultural decay it is currently going through?
Well, let me repeat what I said to you earlier, that I don't think it's a done deal that the West is going down. I think everything is to play for. But let's assume the worst happened and what you're saying comes true, and the West descends into chaos and fighting, and is no longer a partner. I think we're already seeing what Israel will do in response to that. Israel has for some years been pivoting away from America. And this is perhaps one of the most urgent lessons to be learned from this current crisis of this war, this 11-month war, that Israel can no longer be the client state, see itself as the client state of America. Israel has to become self-sufficient in arms. It has to pull away. It has to regard America as an ally, regard Britain as an ally, but not one on which it depends. It cannot afford to do that. And we've seen that in recent years, a pivoting away to a certain extent towards the emerging cultures or countries and powers, India, China. Now, okay, there's an argument to be said, a very strong argument to be said for saying, it's terrible to be embracing China. You're basically embracing the Chinese Communist Party.
There's a big distinction between India and China.
There is absolutely. But nevertheless, what I'm saying is that Israel has already seen, as it were, the writing on the wall, as far as the West is concerned. It's understood that it has to make allies in other areas than the West. And, Israel in the past, and again, it's a vulnerability of Israel. It makes it very vulnerable to criticism, that it's allied itself with some extremely unsavory regimes in the past, because Israel has always done what it has to do, which is that, it is basically alone and it has to find ways of surviving. And it will find ways of surviving. It will make alliances. It will hold its nose and make these alliances on the basis that, and I think this is even more true now than it was even a few years ago, Israel is a powerhouse, militarily and intellectually. People want what Israel produces. They need it. They rely on it. All these people, who are busy trying to boycott Israel, they're all going to throw away their mobile phones. When they have cancer, they're going to say, oh, this cutting-edge technology that will save my life was created by scientists in Israel. I am boycotting it. I think not. In other words, it's not true that Israel is so dependent on the world that it can't survive without it. It's a two-way thing. And so Israel will continue to do what it's always done. It will make unsavory alliances, and it will make alliances which exist and inhere and continue because it's in the ostensibly hostile nation's interest to continue it, because they cannot live without Israeli and Jewish genius. They can't do it. And increasingly they can't do it. So it is a fearsome prospect. Israel alone against the world is a terrible thing. But it won't be against the world. It'll be against a part of the world that we now think is the most powerful part of the world. It may well not be the most powerful part of the world, so that changes the dynamic. But ultimately, we are the Ivrim. We come from the other side. We are the nation that dwells alone. That is our role. The people in Israel who think, no, I just want to be part of the West. And there are thousands of them, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands are on the streets the whole time. That's what they want. I want to be like any other country. We want to be a normal country. No. The destiny of the Jewish people in Israel is to be an abnormal country. It defies all odds. It's always defied all odds. It always will defy all odds, because the Jewish people has always defied all odds and always will defy all odds. That's our role in life. Uncomfortable? Absolutely. Prefer not? Sure. We all want a quiet life. This is our destiny. This is what we are. So to that extent, what's new? So the West goes down. Well, okay, so there's a new set of challenges. We'll deal with it. We'll deal with it just like we deal with the wretched tunnels in Gaza. We'll deal with it. We'll deal with it like we've dealt with, the rockets. And who would have thought of the Iron Dome? Iron Dome. Now we kind of take it for granted. Oh, the Iron Dome. Yeah. Absolutely amazing. This terrible threat of all these rockets. We dealt with it. That's what we do. New challenges? Impossible. Impossible odds. My goodness. They won. My goodness. 1948. No way they could win. Up against the entire Arab world? A few ragtag Zionists? No guns, even? It's over. Here we are. So, that would be my answer. It may be impossibly utopian. I'm not usually known to be a little ray of sunshine, but I am actually remarkably optimistic. And it comes from living here, mainly living here. If I was living in Britain, I would be, basically saying it's all over, it's finished, the West is over. Because that's the way they think. And by thinking that, you make that happen. But by believing in yourself and believing, that you can do it, then you'll do it.
Regarding maybe the biggest challenge, I think, stands in Israel advocacy to the West, is that notion that there is a clear distinction between Hamas terrorists and the so-called ordinary Palestinians. What are your thoughts on this separation, and how can Israel tell the world maybe the truth about it?
I think there's a problem in the West about how people in the West see the Palestinians in general. I'm not actually persuaded that the vast majority make a distinction between Hamas and the Palestinians. I think that they think that Hamas is just the more extreme version of a perfectly reasonable point of view, a reasonable resistance movement. That they don't approve of murder and torture and kidnap. Of course, if you're British, you don't approve of that. But nevertheless, the cause they're fighting for is a perfectly just one.
Hamas is like the IRA, let's say?
Yes, it's rather similar. Some people think that. Some people in Britain do understand that the Hamas have done what they've done and they stand for what they stand for. But the real problem in the West and in Britain in particular is, as you suggest, support for the Palestinians in general and the refusal to believe that they are that they represent a cause that is a bad cause. People in the West, in Britain, believe, insofar as they think about Israel at all, and a very large number don't think about Israel at all, but insofar as they think about it and they kind of take a side, the elites, they will take the Palestinian side because they believe in the lie that's been told for the last half century that the indigenous people of the land of Israel were the Palestinian Muslims. Along came the Jews after the Holocaust. Because of sympathy for their plight, the Western world plonked them down in Palestine, where they drove out the indigenous population, and those Muslims who were left, those Palestinians who were left, they have oppressed ever since. That's basically what people believe. And they believe that because they don't know history of Israel, they know none of the history of the Jewish people, none of the history of the Middle East. And because they're told this all the time by their mainly left-wing university teachers and so on, they have no idea that the Jews are the only people for whom the land of Israel was ever their national kingdom, centuries before Islam was even created. They have absolutely no idea at all. So there's ignorance and ideology, because they think that the Palestinians are like other developing world peoples, poor and oppressed because they've got brown skins. They think Israel is a white-skinned population and is therefore, it must be white because it's Western and it's an adjunct of America. If you tell them that the majority of Israelis are brown or black-skinned,
like me, well, I'm not black-skinned, but
they can't process this. So there's all of that. But I think that, Israel itself has a lot to answer for in this misapprehension. The Jewish communities of the diaspora have a lot to answer for, because nobody has actually told the truth about this. in the Jewish communities of the diaspora, particularly in Britain, which is what I know about, I would say the majority believe in a two-state solution. Why do they believe that? Because they believe basically that this is a fight over land, because this is how it's been projected for a century, that you have a piece of land, you have two peoples, the Jews, the Palestinians, each of which has a claim to the land. We in the West can't arbitrate over that claim, but clearly if you have a piece of land being fought over by two contesting parties, what you do is you negotiate, you bang heads together, you make them separate the land, but you make them divide the land between them. End of problem. That's the two-state solution. One lot has that, the other lot has that. Very neat. The problem is that the solution to which this is the solution, the problem is that the problem to which this is the solution is not identified correctly. It is not a problem over land. It is not a problem over the division of land. If it was a problem over the division of land, it would have been solved in the 1930s when the Palestinian Arabs were offered part of the Holy Land as a state of their own, and they refused and went to war instead to prevent the Jews from having a homeland in any part of that land. That has continued ever since. The Palestinian cause is one of exterminating the state of Israel and removing Israel as a Jewish homeland altogether. And not only is Palestinianism aimed at removing and destroying Israel and removing the Jewish homeland, it's also based on the big lie which rewrites the Jews out of their own history in the land. It pretends that the indigenous people of the land were the Muslims, the Palestinians, and that the Jews are interlopers, where in fact the reverse is true. The indigenous people of the land are the Jews, and the Palestinians do not exist as a people. They say it themselves. They've said it themselves over and over again. We invented it. We invented it in order to twist the minds of the West and in order to present ourselves as having a claim to the land.
Just yesterday, Kamala Harris in the presidential debate with Donald Trump said that Palestinians need self-determination, and that's the cause for a two-state solution in her eyes.
Right. So this is a lie from start to finish, a big lie. Now, bad enough that the universities have been pumping this out for 4 or 5 decades, bad enough that they have been backed by a very sophisticated, hugely financed, very intelligently calibrated campaign by the Palestinian by Palestinian supporters, by Palestinian Arabs and their supporters in the world to fry the minds of the West. Bad enough that's all happened, but it's happened in the way that it has no argument is permitted against this myth, this lie, because of the silence of the Jewish people themselves, the silence of Israel, the silence of the Jewish diaspora. They may inveigh against, as they do, the excesses of Palestinian rejectionism. They may say, at most, Israel will say, they don't want a state of their own, they want to destroy us. Absolutely correct. But what Israel doesn't say, and what the Jewish community doesn't say, is that this is not a fight over land. This is an Islamic-inspired holy war against the Jewish homeland on the basis that the Jews cannot be allowed to live in their own homeland and rule themselves. It's against Islam. And that's what it actually is. And Israel doesn't say it. And Israel doesn't say the Palestinians are not actually Palestinians, that Palestinianism is a thing that was invented in order to create a myth, but that actually, if you look at what the Palestinians so-called are saying, they're not talking about a two-state solution. They're not even talking about Israel. They're talking about eradicating Jews. here are the videos. They're all on Memory, the wonderful website that translates all these videos. They're all there. Israel virtually never uses these things. It never says to the West, your two-state solution is the answer to a problem you have yourselves misidentified, and that you are the reason this is continuing. Your support for this false cause is the reason that it continues. Nobody says that from Israel, and nobody in the Jewish community says that in Britain. Nobody. Nobody says the whole thing is based on a lie. Palestinianism is rubbish. There is no such thing as the Palestinian people. This is a lie invented to destroy us in Israel as a physical country and to remove us as Jews from our own history. It is the worst and most savage kind of cultural appropriation conceivable. That's what's going on, and it's fried all your minds. They're not saying that. So how can anyone know this? And so when you ask, how can we solve this problem of the West saying, well, the Hamas are bad, but Palestinians are good? The way through that is to say individual Palestinians may be fine. Some of them undoubtedly just want a happy life. They are the victims of their own people. These are the ways in which they are the victims of their own people. But they've been told a lie. You're being told a lie. The lie is that the Palestinian cause is a just cause. It is an evil cause. This is why it's evil. And it is evil because it not only wants to destroy Israel, the only country in the world which is targeted for annihilation, it wants to remove the Jews from their own history. And it's evil, and you should be opposing this at source. You should, the West, not be funding these people. You should not be funding the Palestinian Authority. You should be treating them as political, diplomatic, and social pariahs. Pariahs. Instead, you're treating them as statesmen in waiting. You're treating Israel as the rogue element in this because it dares not to want to be annihilated. That's what Israel should be saying. It doesn't say any of this. It could be said, it should be said, and it's not a question of, how can you show people that there is no distinction between Hamas and other Palestinians. It's how do you show people that the Palestinian cause itself is based on a lie and is the source of intellectual and moral corruption in the West, which has knocked the West, in my view, completely off its moral compass. I think the importance of the Palestinian cause to the moral, intellectual, and cultural disintegration of the West, which is underway, cannot be overestimated, because it is the quintessential example of how you no longer, as a Western society, you are no longer able to distinguish between truth and lies, victim and victimizer, and as a result, you take the side of the aggressor over the victim, and you punish the victim by upholding the lies. And this has, I think, cut a swathe through Western society and Western culture far beyond the issue of Israel and the Middle East. I think it's acted as a kind of moral cancer. Palestinianism is a moral cancer in the West, which has corrupted its intellectual elites, fried the collective brain, and destroyed the West's ability to distinguish truth from lies, and the ability, therefore, to defend its own way of life.
Let's move now and talk a little bit about your journey to Jewish identity, more optimistic things. So in your memoir, Guardian Angel, My Journey from Leftism to Sanity, you characterize your home as a secular Jewish home where your family went to synagogue on the high holidays, but you didn't really receive a traditional Jewish religious education. What is the process you went through over the years with your own Jewish identity?
It's a long and I'm sure a very tedious story. I was brought up in a way which is very typical of British Jewish families of that era. I was brought up in the 50s and 60s. And, as you said, my parents belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. They went to shul on high holy days. We kept kosher, both at home and out. but not glatt kosher, but kosher. And I had a very strong Jewish identity, but it was a more kind of cultural identity. I went to Cheder on a Sunday morning, Hebrew classes at the synagogue. I learned virtually nothing. But my mother and father, you know, they had instilled in them...
Respected the tradition.
Yeah, but the moral basis of Judaism was very much part of the way they lived. They were themselves very uneducated in Jewish matters, but you know they did what their parents and their grandparents had done, you know, in the shtetl and so on and so forth. And that's the way I lived. And throughout much of my younger life, I and my husband, we belonged to an Orthodox synagogue, and then we left it for a Masorti synagogue. And then my own views of the world started to change quite radically, which I've described in the memoir that you kindly referred to. And that really opened up a whole way of thinking about the place of religion in the world, which I'd never really thought about. But I came to understand that what was being destroyed in Britain and in the West was basically the religious settlement of the West, which was basically the Mosaic Code at heart. Okay, it was Christianity, but it was the Mosaic Code at heart. And I realized that the Mosaic Code, the link between the Mosaic Code, Jewish values, and the values that we all held dear in the West was absolutely central. And that took me on a further part of this journey. And then for personal reasons, which are too tedious to go into, I came to realize through meeting the kind of people that I'd not really encountered before, which were basically traditionally Orthodox Jews and rabbis, I came to realize at around the same time, it wasn't quite the same time, but around the same time that I had come to realize how fantastically ignorant I was of the Middle East, of Israel, of Middle Eastern history, and particularly, in my case, of the part played by the United Kingdom in the betrayal of the Jews in mandatory Palestine. I came to realize how ignorant I was of all of that, and that started to change my way of the way I looked upon Israel. And I came to realize that certain things I'd kind of taken for granted about, for example, the illegality of the settlements wasn't true. It wasn't true. It was the opposite of the truth. This was a shattering revelation to me. But it was, you know, I realized I had been ignorant. I just hadn't read enough. Once I started to read, and then I started to talk to people about Israel, I realized how little I knew. And the more I realized how little I knew, the more I read. The more I read, the more my views about Israel became quite different. At around the same time, I had the same kind of experience with Judaism, that I realized that I had been taking a view about orthodoxy, the observance of religious Jews, which was based on fantastic ignorance. I knew nothing. And I was horrified. And so I started to talk to people, and that took me into reading more, differently, and it took me down into a journey that I never, ever thought I would make. And so I became much more, by becoming so aware of what I didn't know, I wanted to make good that deficit as far as I could. I've made some inroads into that. The more I find out, the more I learn, the more I teach myself, the more I'm taught about Judaism, the more I realize that there's more that I don't know and that I need to know. And the more I realize I'll never know it. And I'll never know enough. But nevertheless, I make progress down that road. And so it's changed my life.
Okay, so you made an aliyah to Israel, sort of, right? You're now in Jerusalem and in London. And I want to ask you about your thoughts about the division in Israeli society. It started with the big demonstrations against the judicial reform and evolved into the controversy around the war's priorities and goals. Should we go for victory in Gaza, even at the cost of not returning the hostages, or the opposite? Meanwhile, the demonstrations have returned to the streets of Israel, unfortunately, in my opinion, and it seems that the spirit of division that was here before the war is also returning. What do you make of all this complicated situation of Israeli society?
Well, first of all, to take the current demonstrations over the hostages first, I think so much of that is the understandable reaction of the people of Israel, who are going through an unimaginable trauma. And the trauma which started on October 7 not only hasn't gone away, it's got much deeper. And it gets deeper by the day, because while there are still hostages in those tunnels, and we don't know how many are alive, but it tears us all apart, because we know what they're going through. And the grief over those who've died in captivity, and the grief over those who've died in fighting the Hamas, the toll of young soldiers who have died, is unbearable. It's unbearable because it's also unnecessary, because we're up against such an evil, and we're being forced to fight a war in which we're up against the forces of absolute primeval evil, and it's a trauma. And we're such a small society in Israel. It's so few people. Everybody's caught up in this in one way or another, either because they've got relatives who were murdered, or they have children or grandchildren or relatives or friends who are on the front. The grief, the trauma, the frustration of this apparently endless war has taken a terrible toll. And much of this, what we've seen spilling onto the streets, is it's a gut response. And, the most recent demonstrations were triggered by the appalling discovery of the 6 bodies of the 6 hostages. And the unimaginable trauma that they went through, the unimaginable suffering that they went through, I think tipped people over the edge. And the frustration of, when's it going to end, and why can't we get them back, and so on. So when you read what the hostages' families are saying, none of us has the right to criticize them at all. But when you read what's being said, the insanity of blaming Netanyahu for the Hamas atrocities is obscene. And it's a kind of derangement. And this is, you can actually loathe Netanyahu. You can believe that he's guilty of everything he's accused of only wanting to stay in power, doing everything in the most cynical fashion, not caring at all for the hostages, not caring for their families, not caring for the state of Israel. Okay. I mean, I think all that is preposterous. But let's say you believe all of that. You believe he's a really bad guy and you really don't want to be prime minister anymore. Fine. But look at the situation that he is facing, that Israel is facing, with this 8-front war, with America being supportive but actually putting the knife in. No prime minister, none, would have done any differently, in my view, from Netanyahu. I think he made a mistake, however. I think that ultimately he should have leveled with the people. He should have said, we're going to do everything we can to bring those hostages home. Everything. But ultimately, it may not be possible. And ultimately, we have to defend the nation, because we're up against now an Iranian front which is going to destroy us and intends to destroy us and will destroy us unless we focus on that as our main objective, to defeat the Iranian axis against us. He didn't say that. He said we have 2 aims: bring the hostages home, defeat Hamas. that wasn't levelling with the people. He should have looked them in the eye. He should have looked the hostage families in the eye and said, I will do everything I can to bring them home, but ultimately it may not be possible. And if he'd said that, people would have shouted and screamed, but they would have said, he's level with us. Instead, they think he's dishonest. And he was. He was dishonest. So there's all that going on in what's going on now. Go back a stage, as you've just done. Many of these people on the streets are the same people, the so-called Kaplan gang, who organised the enormous demonstrations against judicial reform. Now, it's a swirling mess of agendas here. You have people who are political activists, who, in my view, are wickedly instrumentalizing the plight of the hostages and the agony of the families to secure the aim they have been working for demonstrably since the judicial protests, which were not really about the judicial reform. They're about getting Netanyahu out of power. And to use the hostages and their families in this way is wickedness. That's the last few years. Step back a bit, and I would say that what those political demonstrations represent, put aside the hostage issue for a moment and the understandable emotions and the people who really want the hostages back, put them aside. I'm talking now about the people who want Netanyahu out and who fought the judicial reform, ostensibly judicial reform, but actually to get Netanyahu out. What actually were they doing? I don't think their real problem was judicial reform per se. It was what judicial reform represented to them. What did it represent to them? In the judiciary, as I see it, in Israel, the judiciary is their last hope for influencing Israeli public life in a left-wing direction. The judiciary is basically left-wing. It subscribes to left-wing universalist ideas, universalism in a sort of legal term, as a legal term, human rights beyond the nation, values beyond the nation. And for the left in Israel, the ability for them to achieve political power, to put into practice a left-wing political program, has largely disappeared. And they would say, and I would say, probably disappeared forever because of what happened after Oslo. Oslo was, I think, seen at the time as the great leap into civilized values. We were going to finally end the war, have a two-state solution, there would be a state of Palestine, it would be kumbaya. And the result was the Intifada, second Intifada, 1,000 dead, minimum. And at that point, the Israeli public said, it's over.
No more.
No more. We can't have this. And the right wing, politically, became ascendant. And will be ascendant as long as the Palestinian Arabs continue to wish to annihilate the Jewish homeland, which is for the foreseeable future. So the left was out of political power. But they had one ally, one very important ally, in the court. Now, if the judicial reforms, which I don't defend, I think they were handled ineptly in many respects. I don't necessarily agree with all the program, but nevertheless, it was basically an agenda to put the judiciary into a kind of box and prioritize the political stratum over the judges. And that would mean that the left lost its power completely to influence Israeli society. And that could not happen. They were losing their last chance at power. And that was why the fight, I think, took the form it did of such desperation. And, you know, it was a kind of civilizational thing for them. And from their point of view, it was their last chance to have left-wing perspective. And so stepping back once again, one would say, well, you know, was this just a sort of left-wing thing that arose out of, you know, modern times and so on? And I would say no. Look more closely. look more closely at some of the things those demonstrators against judicial reform were saying. It wasn't just against Netanyahu. They were saying something else I thought was very, very significant. They were saying, as I've said before in this conversation, we want to be like any other country. We don't want to be abnormal. We want to be a normal country, a normal Western country with normal Western ideals. We want to be the same as Britain, the same as America, the same as France, the same as Switzerland, the same as the Netherlands. We don't want to be different anymore. And this is the old argument that goes back to the foundation of the State of Israel. Was the new State of Israel to be the final and most triumphant expression of Judaism and its values, its ancient values, the restoration of the Jewish Commonwealth with all that it represented, rooted in the religion which was rooted in the land? Was it to be this triumphant realization, finally, this return to Judaism? Or was it to be the creation of an entirely new kind of society with a new kind of Jew called the Israeli, who was not religious, because religious people were the people who went into the gas chambers making no attempt to defend themselves? Never again meant, we will never again be like that. We will never again be the religious Jews. We will be a new breed of Jew, a Zionist Jew who is secular, not beholden to these doctrines that kept us all back. We will make a new world based on our strength and our military power, certainly, but our intellectual power, and we will be different. And that's Western. And that tension has never gone away, but it erupted with the judicial reforms, because that's where that was the battleground. You know, the court was seen, I think in many ways correctly, as being representative of those Western values, the new Jew, yes. Nothing to do with the old Jew.
When I talked with demonstrators, they told me that we're afraid from Jewish theocracy.
Exactly.
And I'm like, Benjamin Netanyahu is going to
exactly.
Do
So to them, religion.
Theocracy,
so to them, religion is theocracy, and I'm doing the court a disservice.
Yeah.
I understand. I must acknowledge this, because in many respects, court judgments over the years, Supreme Court judgments over the years, have been to defend the nation. Certainly, I mean, you know, they are patriotic. That's true, except where it comes into conflict, where the values of defending the nation come into conflict with so-called universal values of, you know, humanitarian considerations and all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
And that's where in that tension, they become universalists.
Yes.
But anyway. That's how I saw those divisions then, and it's how I see them now. And again, I see, you know, in those demonstrations that we're now seeing, these divisions will come again. Okay, so I'm reading this. You know, we're again divided. Oh, we've got the demonstrations back.
Right.
And we have. It's true. And some of those actors are the same actors in the judicial reform demonstrations. But it's different now. I think it's very different, because I think when the dust finally settled on this terrible war, we're going to find that the steel has re-entered the Israeli spine. People hope, and I'm one of them, that this generation that we see fighting on the front, exhibiting not just courage, not just heroism, which is there for sure, but exhibiting something else, which is a belief in the Jewish people and their history and their tradition and their culture, which is what they are carrying into battle. They're carrying into battle their responsibility and their duty to the generations that came before. And they're not going to put up with all this nonsense that compromises the defense of the country ever again. And I think the majority of Israelis feel that. They feel it themselves, they share it, and they see these people, and they say we all say to each other, this is the generation that has now to take power. Now, there's a problem. They're not in power. But that's the future. And, you know, I don't believe Israel is a divided society. I believe there are hundreds of thousands of people who are on this kind of Western trajectory. But this society of 9 million and growing, and the demography is taking us into a more Mizrahi demography, into a way of thinking in which an increasing number of people are going to be saying, we're not putting up with this rubbish that is basically decadent, death-wishing Western values. We're going to live. We here are going to live. We here are going to survive. And we are not anymore going to tolerate people who are trying to destroy us from within as well as without. I think that feeling is now so strong and is building. So when people talk about a divided country again, I say, no. There are divisions, of course, and the divisions are hugely exacerbated by what I was saying earlier. Terrible, terrible grief, trauma, frustration, all that. But it will pass. That will pass. The country is strong. The country is not divided. The country is, I wouldn't say it's united. I mean, the idea the Jewish people are ever united, I mean, this is the contradiction in terms.
Hard to find in history, yes.
I mean, they're the most disputatious people on earth. But the majority, the vast majority, know exactly, what they are, what they're fighting for, how they must now fight in future, what they must not put up with anymore. And I think that is entirely positive and an absolute example to the death-wishing West if it chose to look.
Melanie Phillips, final question. What is your next goal, maybe a next work that you've...
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I have written a new book, which I hope we published around the end of the year. Other than to say that clearly I am preoccupied by all the themes that we've been discussing today, I'm afraid I am going to tease you and your readers and viewers by saying that I'm afraid you're going to have to wait until it's published to know any more about it.
So we're going to have another reason for a new podcast. Melanie Phillips, thank you very much for a very powerful interview. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.